The UK is £2.9 trillion in debt, and it's not stopping. Every month, that number grows by about 17 billion. Today, Britain's debt is bigger than its entire economy, and now a new danger looms. The cost of borrowing is climbing to levels not seen in years. For the first time in decades, people have begun to ask, can the UK actually afford all of this debt? For years, UK government bonds were considered one of the safest investments in the world. Pension funds, banks, and foreign governments all relied on them, because in its entire history, Britain has never failed to pay back its debt. That trust kept borrowing cheap, allowing new governments to fund railways, schools, and hospitals without fear. But that era might be over. With prices rising and interest rates climbing, the cost of paying back what we've already borrowed is suddenly exploding. Since the 2008 crash, Britain's economy has barely grown, yet government spending has kept climbing. Now, every time borrowing gets more expensive, it means less money for the services people actually use. Billions that could go to the NHS, pensions, or schools are instead swallowed up just paying off old debt. And borrowing costs don't just hurt the government, they push up mortgages, raise prices, and weaken the pound. Investors are starting to notice. Some want higher returns before they'll lend to Britain, while others are selling off UK debt entirely. The latest government was elected on a promise to bring back stability, a change from the chaos that preceded it, all based on a simple plan: cut debt through tax changes, tighter spending, and faster growth. On paper, this sounded reassuring, but in reality, debt keeps climbing, and investors are starting to doubt if these promises will ever be met. All of this leaves a once unthinkable question: what if confidence in Britain finally breaks? And what would happen if everyone stops buying UK debt? The UK didn't stumble into this crisis overnight. Debt has long been a part of the story for centuries, and for a long time it wasn't a bad thing. It financed post-war rebuilding, expanded railways, and funded the welfare state. If the government needed money for something, it issued bonds, promises to repay investors with interest, and since Britain always repaid, investors trusted it. But trust like this is never guaranteed, and every time it's broken, the pain is immediate. That's exactly what they found out in the 1970s. Britain's deficit was climbing, and the government was spending more than it earned, as growth was slowing and pressure was building. Then, in 1973, everything flipped. In response to Western support for Israel, OPEC cut off oil exports, and overnight the price of oil quadrupled. For Britain, it was devastating. The country relied on imports for 95% of its oil, and within a year, inflation had surged into double digits. As the economy slided, British debt suddenly looked riskier than ever, and interest rates shot up to 15%. Overnight, borrowing became far more expensive, and by 1976, the crisis became so severe that Britain was forced to seek a £2.9 billion bailout from the IMF, the largest loan in their history. This was humiliating, but Britain kept afloat, and the recovery was painful, yet the country never defaulted. And this lesson still holds today. Debt crises can be survived, but only through harsh measures that leave lasting scars. After years of austerity, relief came from the North Sea, and oil revenues poured in, easing the pressure on public finances. Confidence slowly returned, investors came back, and stability was eventually restored. In the decades that followed, Britain kept borrowing, but it also kept growing. Cheap credit held the system together, but the stability was fragile, and the next shock would be far worse. Then came 2008, and the global financial crisis. What began as turmoil on Wall Street quickly spread globally, and Britain was at the heart of the storm. Banks collapsed, credit froze, and unemployment exploded. To stop a complete meltdown, the government had only one option: borrow. Billions went into failing banks, cash was pumped into the economy, and anything was done to keep the system alive. The collapse was avoided, but the recovery never truly came. Growth instead flatlined, and industries from manufacturing to fishing never bounced back, all whilst productivity sank to record lows. Businesses stopped hiring, investment dried up, and uncertainty hung over everything. For the first time in their history, Britain's debt was rising faster than its economy, and in the years that followed, things only got worse. Britain left the EU, and spending kept climbing, and through the 2010s, GDP crawled at just under 2% a year, while debt ballooned by nearly £500 billion. And then, just as Britain was already vulnerable, the world changed overnight.
The coronavirus is the biggest threat this country has faced for decades, and this country is not alone.
It seems like a pattern is emerging, and to stop a complete economic crash, Britain once again borrowed more than ever. The Bank of England slashed interest rates to just 0.1%, and borrowing was practically free. And with that, the floodgates opened. Billions were pumped into furlough schemes, bailouts, and stimulus packages. In some ways, it worked. The economy didn't collapse, but all of this came at a price. Once the dust had settled, Britain's national debt was nearing £2.5 trillion, an increase of $620 billion in just 3 years. For a moment, it seemed manageable. Interest rates were cheap, but underneath, the pressure was building. With so much new money in the system, inflation was inevitable. Prices surged, and the Bank of England had no choice but to yet again raise interest rates. Suddenly, debt wasn't cheap anymore. In the past, growth pulled Britain out of a crisis, but now the economy is stagnant, and people are starting to wonder what Britain is going to do with all of this debt. The signs of a mass sell-off are already there. Before we look more at this, I'd like to thank today's sponsor, Enquiries. If you use the internet as much as I do, then your personal data is already out there, scattered across personal search sites, online directories, and even commercial databases. Data brokers collect and sell it without your consent, and according to the annual breach report, this number is up 211% from 2023 to 2024. That means criminals, stalkers, or even employers can easily access sensitive details like your address, phone number, and family info. That's why Enquiries is so valuable. With just one sign up, they legally contact hundreds of data brokers on your behalf and get your data removed. If it reappears, they go after it again. You can even use their custom removal feature. Just send them any link where your info is exposed and a privacy expert will take care of it. And unlike shady players in the space, Enquiries is the first and only data removal service independently verified by Deloitte, so you know it actually works. It's 3 simple steps: create an account, authorize them to act, and let Enquiries do the rest. Plus, it's risk-free with a 30-day money-back guarantee. Go to enquiries.com/invisiblehand and use the code invisiblehand to get 60% off an annual plan. Now, let's get back to the video. Today, Britain faces a dangerous problem. The cost of borrowing is rising fast. Interest rates on government debt are at the highest level since the 1990s. Just paying the interest on this costs the UK over £100 billion every year, more than defence and almost as much as education. To put that into perspective, each citizen in the UK now owes approximately £41,000 in government debt. Money that could have gone to the NHS, school, or pensions is instead being shipped to the creditors. But here's the danger: as debt rises, investors start to doubt, and when investors doubt, the pound falls. For most countries, that's painful, but for Britain, it's devastating because their economy depends on imports. A weaker pound makes imports from food to energy more expensive. To slow these rising costs, the Bank of England usually raises interest rates, but every bump in these also cuts both ways. It helps cool prices while making borrowing even more expensive. For households, the impact has been brutal. Mortgage rates have soared and credit has become more expensive, and everyday bills keep rising. In 2022 alone, the average mortgage payment in the UK increased by 61%, and at the same time, real wages, incomes adjusted for inflation, have fallen, leaving households poorer and tax revenues weaker. This is exactly the trap. Weaker pay means less spending, which means less tax collected, and at the same time, an ageing population demands more pensions and healthcare, even as the workforce funding them shrinks. The revenue just isn't there. Britain's own Office for Budget Responsibility now warns that if nothing changes, national debt could climb to 270% of GDP in the coming decades. Levels only ever seen in countries in crisis. For investors, that kind of outlook is alarming. Can Britain be trusted anymore? So, what would happen if investors actually stopped buying? For decades, Britain was shielded from shocks because most of its debt was long-term. That gave governments breathing room. Crises took years to filter through, and debt could be used strategically. Now, that advantage is gone. In the past, only 6% of Britain's debt was short-term. Today, that number is 27%. Higher rates now hit almost immediately, with the government being forced to refinance at ever-rising costs. New debt isn't building the future, it's just keeping the current system alive. And every time we borrow, this same point becomes more clear. Unfortunately, now even Britain's most loyal buyers are starting to lose faith. For decades, domestic pension funds were the backbone of the economy, pouring retirement savings into UK government bonds because they were seen as safe and dependable. But since 2021, Private pension schemes have cut their holdings of British debt by almost 40%, a clear sign that trust is vanishing. With domestic buyers retreating, the government is forced to lean more on foreign investors. But there too, the market is unforgiving. Interest rates are rising everywhere, and competition for capital is fierce. Each time Britain goes to sell new debt, it has to offer higher returns to lure buyers, and each rise in these costs ripples through the economy. When the rate on British debt climbs, the Bank of England inevitably follows, pushing up domestic interest rates across the economy. Mortgages, business loans, and credit cards all get more expensive. This makes everything a bit riskier. If that sounds extreme, remember Britain has already come close to a dangerous full-blown crisis. Not in the 1970s, but just 3 years ago. In 2022, the British government, led by Liz Truss at the time, unveiled the now infamous mini-budget. It promised sweeping tax cuts, tens of billions in revenue wiped out, with no matching spending cuts and no plan to close the deficit. For investors, it was the worst possible signal. A country already drowning in debt was now planning to borrow tens of billions more, while showing no plan to pay for it. Overnight, confidence collapsed. Investors dumped British debt, and the pound plunged to a record low against the dollar. And once the sell-off began, it turned into a vicious cycle. Pension funds, which had used government bonds as collateral for borrowing, suddenly saw their assets collapse in value. Creditors demanded more cash to cover their losses, forcing funds to sell even more bonds, driving prices down further. Within days, the financial system was teetering, and the Bank of England had no choice but to step in, launching an emergency program to buy up British debt, not to stimulate growth, but simply to stop the market from breaking. The panic lasted only weeks, but the warning was clear. Confidence in British debt can unravel overnight. And history shows what happens when trust disappears. When Greece and Italy lost investor trust during the Eurozone crisis, their borrowing costs exploded. As debt piled higher, bailouts followed, and austerity scarred their economies for a generation, with the impact still being felt today. The difference is, they had the European Union to fall back on. Britain would be on its own. And that's exactly what makes this position so dangerous. London isn't just another capital, it's one of the world's financial hubs. British debt isn't just held in the UK, it sits in portfolios from Frankfurt to New York, Tokyo to Dubai. Without a safety net, any crisis in Britain would spill outward fast, hitting European banks, shaking bond markets, and spreading fear that the same collapse could happen elsewhere. And the damage wouldn't just be economic. For Britain, something deeper is at stake. A breakdown of trust in British debt would strike at the country's reputation itself. For centuries, Britain has stood as one of the world's most trusted borrowers, a pillar of financial stability. To lose that now would mark more than a financial crisis. It would mark a decline, a sign that Britain, once the largest empire in the world, can no longer guarantee even the strength of its own currency. Before we look at that, I just want to tell you about a new channel we've launched, focusing exclusively on UK issues. You can find the first video about the broken business of pubs by clicking the link in the description. The question then becomes not just whether the UK can manage its debt, but whether it can still live up to its reputation as a safe, reliable power. All of this raises the question, can anything be done to stop the crisis from deepening? The options are few, and none of them are attractive. The first option is to cut spending. In theory, it's simple. Spend less, borrow less, and the pressure eases. But in practice, more often than not, it's political suicide. Last year alone, Britain spent £152 billion more than it earned, and the last time the government ran at a surplus was more than 2 decades ago. Closing that gap would mean cutting into things that voters care about. The NHS, welfare, education, even the so-called triple lock on pensions, the guarantee that payments rise with inflation, would come under pressure. Touch it and millions of retirees see their income squeezed. Leave it untouched and the costs keep rising. Either way, the pain is unavoidable. If Britain is serious about tackling its debt, the decisions will have to cut far deeper than just trimming bureaucracy. The reality is that most public spending doesn't go on overheads. It goes to big commitments, healthcare, pensions, and defence. Without touching those, the deficit will never truly shrink. The issue here is that many people already think the country is broken and nothing works anymore. Removing money from the essential services that keep the country running isn't exactly going to fix that, and will only reinforce the idea of broken Britain. And if cutting into essential services is politically unthinkable, the alternative is just as painful. The government could try and close the gap by raising taxes. On paper, it sounds relatively straightforward. Bring in more revenue to balance the books. But on paper, it comes with heavy risks. The UK is already one of the most heavily taxed economies in the developed world, and pushing rates even higher would squeeze households at a time when living costs are already soaring. Not to mention that the current Labour government has already boxed themselves in by promising not to raise taxes on income. If spending cuts are politically impossible and higher taxes risk choking the economy, there's still one option left, but it's by far the riskiest one. The Bank of England could turn to quantitative easing, creating new money to buy up government debt. On paper, it sounds like an easy fix. Become the buyer yourself and you can push interest rates down and stabilise the market. But in reality, the risks are enormous. Injecting that much money into the system would pour fuel on inflation, just as households are already struggling with prices. And with Britain's reputation already in jeopardy, it would send the worst possible signal to investors. For centuries, people have bought British debt in the belief that it was safe, dependable and backed by discipline. But if the Bank of England resorts to QE simply to cover Britain's existing bills, that trust, which has taken centuries to build, could collapse overnight. The pound would sink, inflation would surge, and foreign creditors would dump British debt on a massive scale, sending borrowing through the roof. Either way, Britain is in a debt crisis, the reality of which the country cannot escape, and the government is running out of time. While cutting spending may be politically explosive, as it stands, it seems like the only way to prevent a full-blown financial crash. Only time will tell what's in store for the British economy. Will leaders find the courage to rein in deficits and restore trust, or are we witnessing the slow decline of a nation once seen as the world's safest borrower?